Hello Year 10, welcome to our lesson today, and today is our final lesson on the early Nazi Party. In today's lesson we're going to practice making some supported inferences from sources, we're going to analyse the provenance of some sources, and we're going to evaluate how useful those sources are. So you need to find this page in your workbook. It's activity 1.15. If you need to pause the video now and do that, then please do. And then when you've got your page ready, hit play once more. So here's your do now, everybody. Again, you'll need to pause the video here. There are 5 quick questions. They are all about keywords that we've had over the last few lessons. Pause now, give yourself a couple of minutes to do this, and then hit play to check the answers. So let's check those answers now, everybody. First of all, the Nazi second newspaper, founded by Streicher, was, of course, Der Stürmer. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2, the Nazis' paramilitary force, we looked at them last time, was, of course, the Sturmabteilung, or the SA. Number 3, the Nazis demanded in their 25-point programme, they demanded Lebensraum. Number 4, a list of policies like the 25-point programme. Well, that one was the word manifesto. And then lastly, one of the ideologies of the early NSDAP focused on reducing inequality and giving workers more control. That was socialism. Did you get them right? How many did you get? Give yourself a score out of 5 and note carefully any that you got wrong. So this is what we're going to do today. In your workbooks, you have 2 sources. They're both about the early Nazi Party. So we're going to be reading these in a moment, and we're going to be having a go at this question, or at least we're going to be practicing on it. How useful are sources A and B to a historian investigating the early Nazi Party? Now, we've been asked here, how useful are the sources? Now, if we're thinking about how useful the sources are, then we need to bear in mind what makes a useful source. A useful source is one which has useful content in it and one which has useful provenance. And we'll talk about both of those in a moment. We also have to focus on the inquiry we've been given. And we've been asked, how useful are these sources for a historian investigating the early Nazi Party? So what do these sources reveal about the early Nazi Party? So let's turn our attention to source A first of all. Take a little look at it for yourself. We'll read it together in a moment, but the first thing I want you to notice about source A is that it is made up of 2 bits. This bit here is the content of the source. That's what's actually in it. And I want you to label that on your own copy. The top part of the source, here it's in bold, is the provenance of the source. That's who made the source, when, where and why. And that word provenance, I need you to know. So when I talk to you about the provenance of a source, I'm talking to you about who made it, when, where and why. Okay, so let's have a read of source A. And I've put a picture there to help you imagine the scene too. Source A is a quotation from a supporter who went to a Nazi party meeting in 1926. And look at what this person writes. A wave of jubilation rising from afar, moving into the lobby, announced the arrival of the Führer, the leader, that's Hitler. And then the auditorium went wild. When the speech came to an end, there were tears in my eyes. Others, men, women and youngsters, were as deeply affected as I. So we've got there a very vivid description of Hitler giving a speech at one of these early Nazi meetings. Now, in today's lesson, we're going to look at how to evaluate a source. And we're going to start by reading an example of a really good evaluation. This student has already evaluated source A, and we're going to look at why it's such a good evaluation. So the first thing that I want you to do is to pause the video, and I want you to read it for yourself before I talk to you about it. So pause now, read it carefully, and then hit play. So this is a really good evaluation because it has all the features of a good evaluation. Let's look at them. First of all, this student has made some inferences or conclusions of her own about the early Nazi Party from the source. For example, here's one of her inferences. She tells us that the source reveals that Hitler was popular in the party. She then supports that inference with a quote from the source. Look, she's taken the quote, "a wave of jubilation" when Hitler arrived. So she's proven her inference with some evidence. She has also supported her inference with some of her own knowledge. So look, she adds to that inference and brings in her own knowledge about Hitler's popularity. She knows that he was the star speaker at many meetings and that a lot of party members came to the meetings because they were attracted to hear Hitler speak. So here we've got a really good example of making an inference, supporting it with a quote, and then supporting it with some of our own knowledge. And look, the student tries to do this a second time. Now, the student tries to follow that same process again with another inference. Look, here's her second inference. She says that the source reveals what a charismatic speaker Hitler was. And she takes a quote from the source to prove that. The source says that the audience was deeply affected. So that suggests Hitler was a very powerful and charismatic speaker. On this occasion, our student hasn't supported that inference with her own knowledge. Perhaps she could have. Perhaps she could have talked about some of the things that Hitler did during his speeches, which made him charismatic. Perhaps she could have talked about his use of voice or the way he used his gestures. Now, in the next part of the evaluation, the student moves away from the content of the source and starts to look at the provenance. Remember, provenance means who wrote the source, when, where, and why. So she identifies one part of the provenance of the source. Look, she says that source A came from someone who attended the meeting. And then she comments on how that provenance affects the value of the source. She says that this makes the source very useful. Somebody who was there at the meeting is a really useful witness of the atmosphere in the room. And the person who made the source actually saw for herself firsthand the impact which Hitler's speech had. So that makes her description seem very believable. So we've got here an aspect of the provenance, and then the student has commented on why that makes the source more useful. Look, she does it a second time as well. Here's another aspect of the provenance. The person who made the source was a Nazi supporter, and was moved to tears by Hitler. And once again, the student has commented on how that affects the value of the source. She believes that this makes the source more useful. It seems to add weight to her inference that Hitler was popular among party members. I mean, here in this source, we've got one of Hitler's supporters writing about how moved she was. So that kind of suggests that Hitler was popular among party members. The final part of the evaluation is a judgment, and it's here. So the source is very useful. Now we're going to practice some of this evaluation today. So here's the source we're going to practice on. It's source B, and once again, the source has two parts to it that I want you to label. First of all, the content of the source. This is what is in the source. And secondly, the provenance of the source. Who made it, when, where, and why. Okay, let's read the source. Source B is the pledge of loyalty and obedience which was taken by members of the SA. And they had to pledge or promise the following. As a member of the NSDAP, I pledge myself by its storm flag to be always ready to stake life and limb in the struggle for the aims of the movement. To give absolute military obedience to my military superiors and leaders. And to bear myself honourably in and out of service. Now it's your turn. In question 4 of your task, you have two inferences from this source, and I want you to support them with a quote and your own knowledge. So here's inference 1. The purpose of the essay was to carry out violence. I want you to support that with a quote from the source, and then I want you to add some of your own knowledge to back it up. Here's the second inference. The essay were organised and disciplined. Again, I want you to support that with some evidence or a quote from the source and some of your own knowledge. Now you might need to look back at your information on the Sturmabteilung to help you with the own knowledge part. I'm going to ask you to pause now and have a go at this before you hit play, and I'll show you how I did on this. Okay, so hopefully you've had a go at this. Let me show you how I got on. With the first inference, the purpose of the essay was to carry out violence. Here's the quote that I chose. The source says they should be ready to stake life and limb in the struggle. And so we've got this idea that they have to be prepared to fight for the party and give their lives if necessary. And I've got some own knowledge to back that up as well. I know the SA were used to disrupt other parties by interrupting their meetings and fighting with them, brawling in the streets, especially with members of the Communist Party. The second inference was that the SA were organised and disciplined. Now I found a quote to back that up too. The source says that they should give absolute military obedience to their leaders. That suggests they were very disciplined. And I've got some of my own knowledge to back that up too. I know that many members of the SA were ex-soldiers. So Hitler put them under the command of Ernst Röhm, who was an ex-officer. And I know that many of them looked up to him and respected him as a leader. So here are my two supported inferences. How did you get on? And now we're going to look at the provenance of the source. So I want you to pause the video now and write down everything you know about the provenance of the source. Firstly, the nature of the source. What type of source is it? Secondly, the origin of the source. Who made it and when? Lastly, what do you think the purpose of the source was? Who was it made for and why? Pause now, have a go at that, and then hit play, and we'll look at some possible answers. So here's how I got on with this task. For me, the nature of the source, well, it's an oath, a sworn promise. You can imagine them standing in front of a flag with their hands on their heart and swearing this. The origin, well, it was made by the SA leadership or the NSDAP leadership, and I think it was probably made in the early 1920s when the SA were first created. We don't know that for sure, but it seems reasonable to predict that. And what about the purpose? Well, it was clearly made for new recruits to the SA, new members. And it was possibly to make expectations clear to them when they joined the SA. It might have been a way of making them feel a sense of belonging to the SA by getting them to swear an oath and agree to these expectations. So maybe it was to make them feel like they belonged as members. Now, remember, we made two inferences from this source. We thought that it revealed that the purpose of the SA was to carry out violence. We also said that it showed the SA were organised and disciplined. Now, think about what you know of the provenance of this source. Does the provenance of this source make us more or less certain about these inferences? I want you to pause now and think about that question, and I want you to have a go and jot your ideas down in this table. When you're ready, hit play and I'll show you some of mine. So here's how I got on, and I'd actually like you to write down these ideas in your own copy of the workbook so that you have some examples to refer back to. My first point was this. This source is an oath for members to swear. So we know that the SA leaders were expecting men to fight for the party. So it seems to add weight to this idea that the purpose of the SA was to carry out violence. I'm going to make another positive point about the provenance as well. It's a set of rules which tells us how they were expected to behave. So maybe that lends weight to the idea that the SA were organised and disciplined. However, as we all know, rules are not always obeyed. Just because we have a set of rules here doesn't mean that SA members always followed them. So I've got a negative point here as well. Rules are not always obeyed, and the source doesn't actually prove that SA members kept to these standards. In fact, I know that sometimes SA members were quite unruly and difficult to control. So this source doesn't prove that SA members always behaved in an organised and disciplined way. Let's finish our lesson by reminding ourselves of some key points to take away. First of all, to evaluate a source, you need to look at both the content and the provenance. Secondly, you should make inferences from the source and then try to support them with quotes and with your own knowledge. Lastly, you should identify aspects of the provenance and say how they make the source more or less useful. That brings us to the end of today's lesson, but I'm looking forward to teaching you in class next time. See you then.